Every bad decision that I made in my life, every sabotaged relationship, every destructive habit, or every moment that I felt lost, it all started with something much deeper than I realized. You see, most people think that their problems are just random, that they just happened. But I've learned the hard way that nothing is just random. Every action, every choice, every self-destructive cycle, it all started somewhere, whether you realize it or not. And more often than not, it started in your childhood. But not because our parents were bad people or not because we were weak, but because whenever we were kids, we didn't have the emotional tools to process what was happening to us at the time. So instead, our brains did something else. They created scripts, they created subconscious beliefs, and they formed patterns of thinking that actually would follow us into adulthood without us even realizing it. So today, I'm going to take you back to where my story began, but not just to tell you what happened, but to really show you how the beliefs formed in my life that would essentially control my life up through adulthood. A lot of sabotage, a lot of self-destructive behaviors, and I've really taken the time to really dissect my childhood and my life to find out why I was so self-destructive as I got older. Like, what happened with the events in my childhood that affected me as I went into adulthood? And I really defined all of that, and it really all came to make sense. And so I'm now sharing the story and the lessons learned and the psychology behind it to hopefully help anybody else that's going through the same things in their adult life, and helping them to come to peace and come to a sense of closure for what happened in their childhood that is now negatively affecting their adulthood. Because I can almost guarantee that somebody that's watching this video is going to be carrying those same patterns that I carried, those same self-destructive patterns that I carried throughout my life. So I'm going to give you some insight on how I got through them, how I got over them, how I recognized them, and move forward with my life to now have a life of peace and joy and understanding and abundance, everything that people search for. But it didn't start off like this. It started off with some heavy duty work to understand the entirety of my life. So the upcoming story and the upcoming series of stories, it's going to tell a story of how abandonment, neglect, and emotional pain really set the stage for self-destruction, and also how to break free. So let's start from the beginning. One day when I was 6 years old, my mom and my dad called my brother and me into the living room. Okay, my parents were going to separate, and they were young too. They had me at 16 and 17, so they were just kids at that time as well. But anyway, so they call us into the living room, and my mother looks at my brother and says, "Who do you want to live with?" Well, my brother says he wants to live with her. And then the question came to me, and I knew the question was coming. And so, I was preparing my answer. From what I remember, I was preparing my answer. And when the question came to me, my immediate thought was, I want to stay with my dad because I don't want him to be alone. So thinking back to that time, and after doing all of this research and all of this unpacking of this moment, I realized that in that moment, it wasn't about what I wanted. I didn't think about what I wanted. I thought about what my dad needed. And just like that, we made our decisions, and ultimately my mother and my brother got in the car and left. And so in that moment, something that I didn't recognize at the time, but something was etched into my subconscious in that moment. Number one is people leave. Number two, love is not guaranteed to stay. And number three, no matter how much you care about somebody, they can walk away. And that single moment shaped how I would view relationships for the majority of my life up until meeting my now wife. So that would be considered a traumatic event for a child to have to experience. And so here's the thing about trauma. It's not just about what happens to you. It's about what your brain decides what that event means. And so at that time, my brain didn't process, I chose my dad. My brain processed, my mother and my brother left me. That's the difference between what happens and what we actually believe about what happens. And it's in those beliefs that becomes the script that you ultimately live by, especially at such a young age when those snapshots are taken, those traumatic events are taken, and then those beliefs, they become the script that you live by until you learn to rewrite that script. So that moment created what's called a fear of abandonment that I didn't know that I had. And the way that my brain coped with that was moving forward throughout my life, I tried to control relationships. Like I wanted love, but I didn't trust it. I wanted connection, but I just feared that it wouldn't last. And so I always sabotaged the relationships that I was in. But it wasn't because I didn't care. It was more in my twisted mind, and this is all subconscious, but I needed to test people. Would they stay if I made things difficult? Would they fight for me if I pushed them away? Would they still love me if I cheated on them? So subconsciously, I'm recreating this abandonment story over and over again. Because deep down, my brain had already made the decision. Love isn't safe, and people always leave. And since our brains crave certainty, I made sure subconsciously that that belief was always proven true. I'd subconsciously push people away just to see if they would come back. And, if they didn't, it reaffirmed everything. See, I knew it. People that love you will leave. And it makes no sense whatsoever, but that's what our brain does. Because this is how trauma works. So it's not just the pain of the past, it's the repeated cycle of recreating that same pain in new ways. And here's the jacked up thing, because the brain would rather be right about a painful belief than risk being wrong about something that could hurt even worse. Now, if some of you have made it this far and you're thinking, yeah, I had a rough childhood, but I got over it. I don't even dwell on the past. It doesn't affect me at all. It happened, but I moved on. I'm fine. And here's what I'll say to that. Are you? Because childhood trauma doesn't necessarily show up as suffering. It doesn't show up as you thinking about whatever happened and being mad about it or being hurt by it. That's not how it shows up oftentimes. Most of the time, that's not how it shows up. Sometimes it'll show up as impatience. Because as a child, you had to take care of yourself, and now as an adult, you have no tolerance for anything that slows you down. Sometimes it shows up as anger issues because no one ever taught you how to regulate your emotions or how to express frustration in a positive way. Sometimes it shows up as sarcasm and humor. We all know somebody like that that's just always sarcastic, always telling jokes. And a lot of times that shows up because it's just easier to make jokes than admit when something hurts. Sometimes it's overworking yourself to exhaustion. Like we all know the grind hustle culture. Some people just overwork themselves. And the reason they do that is because deep down, they believe that their worth is based upon how much they can produce, as opposed to having a high self-worth just based upon who you are as a person. For their self-worth, it's all about production. But here's the reality. If you don't face your past, it's going to continue showing up in your present. It's going to show up as impatience. It's going to show up as anger issues. It can be the most minute thing, and some people blow up and make it this huge deal. But in that same vein, they say, well, my past doesn't bother me. Yes, it does, because the way that you're acting now is completely based upon the programs that your brain's created based off of events that happened in the past. That's just how it works. You can't deny that. The other thing is, if you don't fix what hurt you, you're just going to pass that hurt on to other people. It's like the old saying goes, hurt people hurt people. And that's true, unfortunately. And a lot of people don't face their past pains and their past hurts. And it just goes on to the next people. The same thing with me when I had young parents. They each did their best, but they each had their own pains and traumas that were never dealt with. And so they didn't know how to then raise kids in a emotionally healthy way. It's no dig on them. It just, at that time, they just didn't have the information. They didn't learn it and they didn't know it and they never experienced it. So how could they, raise us any different? How could your parents raise you any different? They did the best they could with the tools that they had. And so often it's so easy to just place blame on somebody for the way that you turned out, but you're still just shifting blame instead of looking at them as people that were doing the best that they could with the knowledge and the wisdom that they had at that time. Now, certainly there's a lot of narcissistic or selfish behavior that some people's parents put them through. And again, that falls right in line with some issues that they've never dealt with that have created them to be selfish, that have created them to be narcissistic. And then it just bleeds off on you, and it becomes your duty to end the trauma that you've been going through. There's a video that I made a few days ago or a week ago. It's called It's Up to You. And it's all about this. It's all about you. It's up to you to end the generational traumas that you've gone through. So back to the story. So I had these abandonment issues, right? That's a script that I lived with for years without realizing it, without consciously knowing the reasons why I was doing what I was doing. But once I saw it, everything changed for me, because the truth is, you're not broken. Nobody's broken. You're not doomed to, stay in your past. You're not doomed to stay in your trauma. Your past shaped you, but it doesn't have to define you. I say that all the time. The things that you've gone through have shaped who you are, but they don't have to become who you are. But the first thing that you need to do is to realize that you're running an outdated program. You're running an outdated script that isn't serving you. Because it is possible to live in joy and peace and happiness and abundance on a daily basis. And most people just do not feel that way. They're negative, they're gossipy, they're hurt, they're angry. They're carrying around these grudges and this resentment and this baggage, and it doesn't have to be like that. But again, you have to become aware of it. That's the first step. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about something that most people don't even realize shaped them. You see, because not all trauma comes from what happened. Sometimes our trauma can come from what didn't happen, the love you didn't receive, the emotional connection that you never felt, or the validation that you never got, so you stopped expecting it. And if you've ever struggled with low self-worth, shutting down, or feeling like your emotions don't matter, then the next episode will be very helpful. Because once you understand how emotional neglect works, you can finally stop blaming yourself for things that you were never taught. And that's where real healing begins. So stay tuned for this series. We're just getting started. It's going to be, like I said, my story dispersed with the psychology and the reasoning and the healings behind it. Hit that bell icon so it'll send you a notification when the next episode drops. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, because what that does is it's going to allow this message to get out to more people. And that's pretty important because, a lot of people need to hear this type of stuff. So I appreciate you tuning in. And as always, make good choices. And I'll see you on the next one.